In the quiet hills of Israel, under the weight of oppression from the Philistines, a child was to be born whose destiny would shake the foundations of a nation. His story began not in the midst of battle or war, but in the humble home of Manoah and his wife. They were a couple long burdened with the grief of infertility, their hearts heavy with the longing for a child. But one day, the messenger of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife, a divine visitation that would change everything. The angel spoke with a message of hope and promise. She would conceive and bear a son. But this son would be no ordinary child. He would be set apart from birth, consecrated to the Lord as a Nazirite, a man of strength and purpose. This child would be the beginning of Israel's deliverance from the oppressive rule of the Philistines. The angel's instructions were clear. The mother was to abstain from wine, strong drink, and anything unclean, as the child was to be dedicated to God, and no razor should ever touch his head. The announcement was both joyous and filled with solemn responsibility. Manoah and his wife were chosen to raise a child who would be a living instrument of God's will. Yet with that calling came immense pressure. They knew this child was part of a divine plan far greater than they could comprehend. The weight of such a calling was heavy upon them, but their faith remained steadfast. As the seasons passed, the promise of the angel came to fruition. Manoah's wife bore a son, and they named him Samson. From his birth, there was something different about him, something larger than life. His presence seemed to emanate with an undeniable strength, and even as a child, his eyes carried the weight of a destiny that would unfold in the most extraordinary ways. His parents raised him with the knowledge that he was chosen for something great, though they could not yet see the full scope of what was to come. Israel, however, was a land in turmoil. The Philistines, fierce and powerful, had oppressed Israel for many years, their domination harsh and unyielding. The people of Israel lived under their control, suffering greatly. But, unknown to them, in the midst of their suffering, God had already chosen a deliverer, a man who would rise not just in strength, but in the courage to defy the Philistines and restore the hope of his people. As Samson grew, the divine promise that had been made to his parents began to manifest in ways both awe-inspiring and unsettling. From an early age, it was clear that Samson was unlike any other child. His physical strength, even as a young boy, was remarkable, and there was a certain fire in his eyes that spoke of a larger purpose. His parents, who had longed for a child for so many years, now had the gift of a son, and with him, the weight of an unspoken destiny. Don't forget to like and share with your friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories, and turn on the bell to receive notifications firsthand. We want to hear your opinion. Comment below on what you think of this video and share your thoughts with us. Let's be part of this journey of faith and learning together.
Samson's childhood was one of both privilege and pressure. His parents raised him in the knowledge that he was chosen for something extraordinary, something much greater than himself. They taught him the ways of the Lord, guiding him in the principles of the Nazirite vow. He was taught to respect his vow and live a life apart from the world around him. No razor ever touched his head, and he adhered strictly to the restrictions of the vow, as was required for someone dedicated to God's service. But Samson's strength was not limited to the physical. As he grew, so did his courage and boldness. He was fearless, standing tall in the face of danger, driven by an inner power that no one could understand. Yet there was also a fire of independence burning inside him. It was clear that despite his parents' guidance, Samson struggled with the limitations imposed on him by his vows. As much as he was a man of God, he was also a man of intense passions and desires, and that would prove to be both his strength and his undoing. His relationship with his parents was filled with love and respect, but also with tension. Samson's father, Manoah, recognized the greatness in his son, yet at times he feared that the weight of the mission placed upon him might overwhelm him. Samson's mother, on the other hand, kept her faith in the promise that had been made to her, but she too felt the burden of raising a child who was set apart for something so monumental. The tension between duty and desire grew as Samson matured, and the young boy soon became aware of the power he wielded. It was clear to all who saw him that Samson was destined for something more than a simple life. He was born into a world of struggle and oppression, yet in his heart there was a yearning for freedom and purpose. The child who had been marked by God from birth was now coming to age, and as his strength grew, so too did the whispers of his future. Little did he know, the journey ahead would test not only his physical strength, but his very soul. As Samson entered adolescence, the fire of rebellion began to burn more fiercely within him. Raised with the knowledge of his divine calling, he understood that he was set apart from the rest of Israel. But with that sense of purpose came a powerful desire to break free from the limitations imposed on him by his Nazirite vow and the expectations placed on him by his parents and society. It was as if the weight of his destiny was too great for him to bear, and he began to struggle with his identity as both a man of God and a man of passion. His relationship with his parents was filled with love and respect, but also with tension. Samson's father, Manoah, recognized the greatness in his son. Yet, at times, he feared that the weight of the mission placed on him might overwhelm him. Samson's mother, on the other hand, kept her faith in the promise that had been made to her, but she too felt the burden of raising a child who was set apart for something so monumental. The tension between duty and desire grew as Samson matured, and the young boy soon became aware of the power he wielded. It was clear to all who saw him that Samson was destined for something more than a simple life. He was born into a world of struggle and oppression, yet in his heart there was a yearning for freedom and purpose. The child who had been marked by God from birth was now coming to age, and as his strength grew, so too did the whispers of his future. Little did he know, the journey ahead would test not only his physical strength, but his very soul. As Samson entered adolescence, the fire of rebellion began to burn more fiercely within him. Raised with the knowledge of his divine calling, he understood that he was set apart from the rest of Israel. But with that sense of purpose came a powerful desire to break free from the limitations imposed on him by his Nazirite vow and the expectations placed on him by his parents and society. It was as if the weight of his destiny was too great for him to bear, and he began to struggle with his identity as both a man of God and a man of passion.
Samson's first confrontations with the Philistines were not born out of a desire for conflict, but rather as a result of his increasing frustration with the oppression of his people. Israel, still under the harsh rule of the Philistines, was helpless in the face of their conquerors, and Samson felt an intense urge to do something, anything, to stand up for his people. The Philistines, however, were not content to simply leave him alone. They saw him as a threat, a wild force that could disrupt their dominance. One of Samson's first acts of defiance came when he encountered a young lion on his travels. The beast attacked him, but Samson, fueled by an inexplicable strength, tore it apart with his bare hands. This was not just an act of self-defense, but a demonstration of the immense power that had been given to him by God. It was also the first glimpse of the man Samson would become, someone who, when pushed, would unleash a fury unlike anything Israel had ever seen. But with that strength came the beginning of Samson's internal conflict. His desire to act on his own terms, to follow his own path, began to clash with his divine calling. He was born to free Israel, but he was also deeply connected to his personal desires, and those desires were beginning to pull him in different directions. His relationship with God, which had been marked by purpose and clarity, was becoming more complicated as he struggled to reconcile his gift with his personal will. The Philistines, aware of Samson's growing power, sought to control him, and they began to realize that the key to defeating him lay in discovering the secret of his strength. They knew it wasn't just his physical prowess that made him invincible. There was something divine at work, and they were determined to break him. Samson, though, was unaware of their plotting, for now he believed his strength was his alone, and he acted on his impulses without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. As the young man grew, so did his reputation. But with every victory came a growing tension. He was no longer just fighting physical enemies, he was fighting the battle within himself, the battle between the man he was meant to be and the man he feared he might become. Samson's journey was far from over, and the challenges ahead would force him to confront not only his enemies, but his deepest fears and desires.
Samson's path, already marked by a growing internal struggle, took an unexpected turn as he sought a wife among the Philistines. His desire for companionship, a yearning for something more than the life of a warrior and a judge, led him to a woman from Timnah, a Philistine city. His parents, however, were troubled by his choice. They knew that Samson, born to be the deliverer of Israel, was not meant to be yoked with the enemies of God's people. His marriage to a Philistine woman was a direct violation of the laws that had been laid down for Israel, to remain separate, holy, and distinct from the surrounding nations. Yet Samson, in his growing defiance and impatience with the constraints of his calling, insisted on this union. "She is the one for me," he declared, ignoring the pleas of his parents to find a bride from among his own people. To him, the woman's beauty and allure were enough to justify the union, and the voice of his parents seemed distant, irrelevant to the desires of his heart. The tension between Samson and his parents grew. Manoah, his father, was perplexed and disappointed, struggling with the reality that his son, destined for greatness, was making choices that would surely complicate the divine plan for Israel's deliverance. His mother, though also troubled, held to her faith in the promise given to her by the angel. She prayed that Samson's heart would be led by God even in his disobedience, and that God would work through his choices, no matter how misguided they might seem. The marriage proposal itself was steeped in irony. Samson's parents went with him to the Philistine city of Timnah for the arranged feast, an event that would mark the beginning of a journey filled with unexpected twists. During the feast, Samson found himself confronted by a new challenge that would test not only his strength, but his wits. The Philistine guests, sensing that Samson's position as the champion of Israel was precarious, challenged him to a riddle contest. Samson, ever confident in his abilities, accepted the challenge and posed a riddle to the guests, offering a reward to anyone who could solve it. However, the riddle was based on a deeply personal experience, the lion he had slain earlier, from which he had taken honey. The connection between the riddle and the lion's carcass was subtle and complex, a symbol of Samson's inner turmoil and his relationship with the divine. But the Philistines, eager to see him fail, pressured Samson's new wife into betraying him. They threatened her with harm if she didn't extract the answer from him, forcing her into a dilemma between loyalty to her husband and fear for her own life. Ultimately, she betrayed Samson, revealing the answer to the riddle to the Philistine guests. When Samson found out, he was enraged. His sense of pride and betrayal led him to take a brutal revenge. He killed 30 Philistines and took their clothes as payment for his lost wager. But the act of vengeance only deepened his isolation. This moment was crucial for Samson. The events surrounding his marriage to the Philistine woman and the subsequent violence set the stage for the deeper conflicts to come. His personal desires and the pressures of his calling were now inextricably tied together, pulling him further away from the path of righteousness and closer to the chaos that would eventually consume him. Samson's marriage to the Philistine woman was not just a personal choice, it was a catalyst that would spark a deeper and more violent conflict with the Philistines and with his own fate. His internal battles had begun to manifest in the physical world, and every action he took, every choice he made, was leading him further down a path of struggle, loss, and redemption. After the betrayal of his riddle by his wife and the violent vengeance he had taken, Samson's relationship with the Philistines began to deteriorate rapidly. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of his personal desires and divine calling erupted into open conflict. Despite his marriage, Samson was still the man chosen by God to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Philistines, and he could not escape his destiny, no matter how much he tried to live life on his own terms. Samson's first great act of defiance came shortly after the fallout from his wedding. Furious with his wife's betrayal and the Philistines' mockery, Samson left Timnah in a fit of rage. He retreated to his home in the hills of Israel, but his turmoil was far from over. The Philistines, sensing that they had insulted Israel's champion, came after him. Samson, however, was no ordinary man, and he was not one to shy away from a fight. When the Philistines sent their men to capture him, he responded with a heroic display of strength that would become the stuff of legends. As they approached, Samson found himself facing a massive force of men, yet he stood unshaken. With the fury of a lion, he broke free from his chains, seizing the jawbone of a donkey lying nearby. In one of the most dramatic and awe-inspiring moments of his life, he used this jawbone as a weapon, slaughtering 1,000 Philistines with it. This battle, though it seemed improbable, was an overwhelming victory for Samson, who proved once again that his strength was not of human origin, but divine in nature.
His victory sent shockwaves through the Philistines, who had underestimated him. But Samson was not done. Though Israel had been under the thumb of the Philistines for so long, his act of rebellion was only the beginning of his campaign against them. The Philistines, humiliated by his ability to destroy an entire battalion with nothing but the jawbone of a donkey, realized that Samson was a force to be reckoned with. However, Samson's power came at a cost. His impulsive nature and violent responses began to alienate him from his own people, even as he struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. In the aftermath of his victory, Samson retreated to a lonely place. Exhausted, both physically and emotionally, he was forced to reflect on the path he had chosen. While his actions had brought immediate relief to Israel, they had also made him a target. He had become a symbol of both hope and destruction, and his path forward was unclear. Samson's victory over the 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone was a symbolic moment in his journey. It demonstrated that despite his personal flaws and struggles, God's power still flowed through him. This victory was not just for Samson's glory. It was a sign that Israel could be freed from the shackles of oppression if it turned back to God. But Samson, in his heart, knew that there was still much to do, and the price for his actions was yet to be fully revealed. As Samson's reputation as a mighty warrior grew, so did the complexity of his personal life. Although he had experienced great triumphs, the tension between his divine calling and his human desires was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. One of the most significant and defining relationships in Samson's life was with Delilah, a woman who would ultimately play a pivotal role in his downfall. Samson's meeting with Delilah occurred in the land of the Philistines, and from the start, their relationship was fraught with both passion and danger. Delilah, with her beauty and charm, was unlike any woman Samson had known. She was alluring and captivating, but there was something more to her that even Samson could not fully comprehend. She seemed to understand his deepest vulnerabilities, and her presence brought him a sense of peace, something that he hadn't experienced in the chaos of his battles and personal struggles. But Delilah's intentions were not pure. The Philistine rulers, aware of Samson's power, saw him as the greatest threat to their dominion over Israel. They knew that if they could discover the secret of his strength, they could finally neutralize him for once and for all. Delilah, being approached by the Philistine leaders, was offered a significant reward if she could uncover the source of Samson's strength. Caught between the lure of wealth and the desire for Samson's affection, Delilah found herself trapped in a web of manipulation, and Samson,
blind to her true motives, was drawn deeper into her spell.
At first, Delilah's questioning seemed harmless. She asked Samson about the secret of his extraordinary strength, but he was cautious in his responses. He provided her with false answers, testing her trustworthiness. Yet Delilah was persistent, and her insistent pleas began to wear down Samson's defenses. With each interaction, Samson's affection for her grew, and he began to reveal more than he should have. As Delilah pressed him, he offered her a partial truth, telling her that if his hair were cut, his strength would be gone. Delilah, knowing now the key to his power, began to plot his betrayal. The tension in their relationship grew. Samson, for all his strength, was vulnerable in ways he had not anticipated. Delilah's manipulation intensified as she used both love and deceit to coax out the final piece of information. Samson, believing in her love, gradually let down his guard. Delilah's insistence and the emotional weight of their relationship clouded his judgment, and he began to believe that love was enough to protect him from harm. But Delilah, in her heart, was not working for their love or their future together. She had her own agenda, one that would forever change the course of Samson's life. The trust Samson placed in her would soon be shattered, and with it, his strength, his destiny, and his life would be forever altered. In the end, Delilah's manipulation was the turning point in Samson's journey, a betrayal that would set in motion his tragic downfall. The tension between Samson and Delilah, now fully entwined in a web of deceit, reached its inevitable climax. Samson, blinded by love and trust, had no idea the danger that lurked beneath Delilah's sweet facade. She had gained his confidence, and with it, the most vital secret of his existence. His strength was tied to his hair, and as long as it remained uncut, he would remain invincible.
One fateful night, Delilah, having been pressured by the Philistines, finally put her plan into motion. After repeatedly failing to extract the truth from Samson, she became more insistent, pushing him further each time with her feigned affection and honeyed words. She wept, begged, and pleaded, using every tool at her disposal to break down his resistance. Samson, exhausted from the constant manipulation and feeling the weight of his own desires and emotional turmoil, finally relented. As he lay in Delilah's lap, lulled into a false sense of security, he revealed the truth that would ultimately destroy him. "If my hair is cut, my strength will leave me." The words left his mouth with a sense of finality, a quiet surrender to the woman he had trusted. He believed that his divine protection and strength were invulnerable, and that no harm could come to him. What he failed to realize was that Delilah, no longer pretending to be the loving woman she once appeared to be, had no intention of protecting him. She had already set the trap, and now she was prepared to spring it. Delilah, satisfied with his admission, sent for the Philistine lords. As Samson slept, Delilah summoned a servant to shave his head. The cutting of his hair was the final step in his downfall. The very symbol of his strength, the Nazirite vow that set him apart, was stripped away in one swift motion. As Delilah cried out for help, Samson awoke, and in his usual manner, he tried to rise and fight the Philistines, confident in his strength. But to his horror,
nothing happened. His body was weak, his power gone. He was no longer the mighty warrior he had been. The Philistines rushed in, capturing Samson without resistance. They bound him, mockingly parading him through the streets as a broken man. The very man who had once torn apart lions and slain thousands with his bare hands was now reduced to a prisoner. They gouged out his eyes, rendering him blind, and dragged him away to the city of Gaza, where he was imprisoned and forced to work in a mill, grinding grain like a common slave. Samson's humiliation was complete. Not only had he been captured, but he had been stripped of his dignity, his power, and his connection to God. His physical eyes had been gouged out, and his spiritual sight was clouded by his betrayal, his loss of faith, and the realization that he had fallen into the trap of his own desires. As he worked, turning the millstone day after day, he had time to reflect on his failures and his reckless behavior. His arrogance, his impulsivity, and his pride had all led him to this point. But even in his darkest moment, a glimmer of hope remained in Samson's heart, the possibility of redemption. Samson's days of freedom had ended. Now in captivity, his life was a constant reminder of his fall from grace. The mighty man, once feared by all, was now reduced to a slave. Bound by chains, blind and defeated, he was forced to work in the prison mill of Gaza, the city that had become his prison and the symbol of his own personal destruction. The work was grueling, endless, and humiliating, grinding grain under the watchful eyes of the Philistines who mocked him at every turn. Samson's once mighty hands, which had torn apart lions and slain thousands with his bare hands, were now reduced to a prisoner.
Every day, as he pushed the heavy stone in circles, Samson could feel the weight of his actions, the years of pride, arrogance, and rebellion against God. He remembered the vows he had broken, the trust he had betrayed, and the choices he had made that had led him here. His blindness, both physical and spiritual, was a symbol of his failure to see the truth. He had trusted in his own strength, in his ability to defeat any enemy, and in his desires. But now, in the silence of his captivity, he had nothing left but the bitter reflection of his mistakes. The Philistines, however, did not just imprison him for punishment. They sought to use him as a spectacle. Every time they paraded him through the streets, it was with the intent to show the world that they had defeated the mighty Samson. They laughed at him, mocking the once great warrior who had humbled so many of their own people. His humiliation was their victory, and they took great pleasure in his suffering. But Samson, in his broken state, began to remember something more important than his failures, the purpose for which he had been born. While the days dragged on, Samson began to pray. His prayers were not the prayers of a man seeking vengeance or glory, but of a man seeking redemption and understanding. He realized that his strength had never been his own. It had always come from God. His fall had not been due to his physical weakness, but to his failure to keep his covenant with God. His hair had been a symbol of that covenant, and it was only now, in his complete vulnerability, that he truly understood the importance of remaining faithful to the Lord. Samson also thought of Israel, the people he had been born to save. They were still oppressed, still under the rule of the Philistines, and he had failed them. Yet, even in the darkness of his prison cell, there was a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance for him to fulfill his purpose, to redeem himself, and to deliver Israel, even if it cost him everything. As the months passed in the dark and lonely prison, Samson's hair slowly began to grow back. It was a quiet and subtle sign, unnoticed by the Philistines, but for Samson, it marked the beginning of his spiritual restoration. The physical growth of his hair symbolized a renewal of his covenant with God, and though his eyes remained blind, his heart was beginning to open once more to the possibility of redemption.
In the silence of his captivity, Samson began to pray with a sincerity he had never known before. He no longer prayed with the same arrogance that had once defined him. Now, his prayers were filled with humility and repentance. He understood that his strength had never truly been his own, but was a gift from God. The hair that had once been the symbol of his power had been cut away in betrayal, but now, as it grew back, it was a sign of God's grace, an opportunity for renewal and a second chance. One evening, as Samson's hair continued to grow, the Philistines gathered to celebrate their victory over Israel and its hero. They were hosting a grand feast in the temple of their god, Dagon, to commemorate their conquest and to mock Samson, who had once been a threat to their people. The Philistine rulers, drunk with pride, ordered that Samson be brought before them as a display of their superiority. They mocked him and made sport of his downfall, bringing him out to perform for their amusement. Samson, though humiliated and blind, felt something stir within him, a renewed sense of purpose and strength that was not physical, but spiritual. He asked to be placed between the two main pillars that supported the temple. The Philistines, unaware of his true intentions, complied. It was in this moment that Samson offered his final prayer to God, not seeking vengeance for his own suffering, but asking for the strength to fulfill his divine purpose. "Lord God, remember me," he prayed. "Please strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." His request was humble, knowing that he had failed in many ways, but trusting that God, in his mercy, could still use him to fulfill the mission he had been given. As he stood there, his hands on the pillars, Samson's body surged with a newfound strength that could only come from God. He pushed with all his might, and with a thunderous roar, the pillars began to crack. The entire temple began to collapse, and in the final moments, Samson, though blind and broken, brought down the very structure that had symbolized the Philistines' dominance over Israel. The temple of Dagon, once a symbol of the Philistine god's power, was reduced to rubble. Thousands of Philistines, including the rulers, were killed in the collapse, and Samson, in his final act, achieved the deliverance of Israel. He had fulfilled his purpose, though at the cost of his own life.
Samson's final act of defiance against the Philistines was not just a physical confrontation, but the culmination of his entire life's purpose. As the Philistines gathered in the temple of Dagon, celebrating what they saw as their ultimate victory over the people of Israel, they did so with great pride. Samson, their once unstoppable enemy, now blind and shackled, was reduced to a mere spectacle for their amusement. They laughed and mocked him, using his downfall as a public display of their superiority. Samson, though defeated in their eyes, was not broken in spirit. They brought him into the temple, tying him to a post and making him stand in front of the large crowd. The temple was filled with revelers, and the sounds of music, laughter, and celebration filled the air. The Philistine rulers, drunk with pride and arrogance, thought themselves invincible. Samson's capture, they believed, was the final confirmation of their god's supremacy. But unbeknownst to them, the true power had always been with the God of Israel. Samson, in his blind state, was led to stand between the two massive pillars that held up the temple. This was no accident. He knew the temple's architecture well, having been brought here many times during his captivity. His heart beat with a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet confidence that could only come from God. Samson's body, still broken and worn, had a strength rising within him that was not of his own making. He knew that this was the moment God had prepared him for all along. With a calm resolve, Samson spoke a final prayer, asking God for the strength to carry out his last mission. O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. In those words, Samson acknowledged his past failures, but also the grace of God who had chosen him to carry out the deliverance of Israel despite his imperfections. The Philistines, unaware of Samson's intentions, mocked him even more as he positioned his hands on the pillars. They were so caught up in their false sense of victory that they didn't see the storm that was about to be unleashed. With a final, tremendous surge of strength, Samson pushed with all his might, his hands pressed firmly against the massive stone pillars. The pillars, which had supported the weight of the temple for generations, groaned under the strain.
With a deafening crash, the temple began to collapse. The ground trembled and the walls crumbled, bringing down the entire structure. The Philistines, who had once mocked Samson and his God, were now caught in the ruins of their own temple. The mighty edifice they had built to honor their false gods was reduced to rubble in a single moment. In that moment of destruction, Samson achieved what seemed impossible: the complete destruction of the Philistine rulers and their temple, as well as the liberation of Israel from their oppression. Samson, in his final act, not only avenged himself for his personal humiliation, but also fulfilled his divine mission. Though he died in the ruins of the temple, his death was a victory for Israel. Samson had accomplished what he was born to do. He had delivered his people from the tyranny of the Philistines, even if it cost him everything. The destruction of the Temple of Dagon was not only the physical collapse of the Philistine stronghold, but also the tragic end of Samson's life. As the dust settled and the rubble of the once imposing temple buried its inhabitants, Samson lay among the ruins. The roar of the collapsing structure, the cries of the Philistine leaders, and the devastation that followed were all a testament to the magnitude of his sacrifice. Samson, though blind and broken, had been used by God to fulfill his plan of deliverance for Israel. With his final act, he had brought an end to the Philistines' reign over Israel, avenging the oppression of his people. But this victory came at a high price. Samson's life was taken in the rubble, his body crushed under the weight of the destruction he had caused. His death was the ultimate sacrifice, the final act of defiance against those who had tormented Israel for so long. As the dust cleared and the survivors of the collapse staggered from the wreckage, the magnitude of Samson's sacrifice became clear. The Philistine rulers, once certain of their power, now lay in ruin. Samson, in the very moment of his death, had caused the deaths of thousands of Philistines, including their leaders. But his death was not in vain. It was a redemptive death, a death that paved the way for Israel's freedom. The people of Israel, who had suffered for so long under the weight of the Philistines' oppression, now had reason to hope. They did not yet know the full extent of what Samson had done, but they would soon hear of his sacrifice. Samson, despite his flaws, had ultimately fulfilled the role that God had intended for him. He had not only been a man of great strength, but also a man who had fallen and been restored, a man who had repented and sought redemption. His death was the ultimate redemption for Israel.
In the aftermath of Samson's death, his body was recovered from the ruins and brought back to his family. There, his family and the people of Israel would mourn the loss of a man who, despite his mistakes, had been chosen by God to bring them freedom. He had been a judge, a warrior, and a leader. But most importantly, he had been a servant of God. In the years that followed, Samson's story would become a legend among the people of Israel. His name would be spoken with reverence, and his sacrifices would be remembered for generations. His life, though marred by failure and impulsiveness, had ultimately been one of redemption and divine purpose. Samson had been the instrument through which Israel was delivered, and his legacy would endure long after his death. Samson's death marked the end of an era for both the Philistines and Israel. His heroic act of destruction had rid the land of its oppressors and brought a long-awaited freedom to the people of Israel. Though Samson had been a flawed and complex figure, his legacy was one of redemption, sacrifice, and the undeniable hand of God at work in the most unlikely of vessels. The immediate impact of Samson's death was felt throughout Israel. For the first time in years, the Philistine threat was effectively neutralized, and the Israelites no longer lived in fear of their captors. There was a sense of hope and renewal within the nation as the burden of oppression was lifted. But beyond the physical freedom, Samson's death marked a turning point in the spiritual history of Israel. Samson's legacy, however, was not solely about the victories he won in battle. It was about the profound lessons he left behind, lessons about faith, failure, and redemption. Samson's life had been a series of triumphs and defeats, but through it all, one thing remained constant: God's calling upon him. His story was a testament to the fact that no one is beyond redemption, no matter how many mistakes they make or how far they fall. Samson's death forced the Israelites to reckon with the idea of divine purpose and human weakness. He was a man chosen by God, but he had stumbled in many ways. His pride, his impulsive nature, and his failure to keep his covenant with God had cost him dearly. Yet, in the end, it was through his sacrifice that Israel was freed. Samson's life and death illustrated the redemptive power of God, showing that even in our greatest failures, God can work to bring about his will.
The people of Israel began to see Samson not as a man who had failed, but as a hero who had fallen and, in the end, redeemed himself through his sacrifice. His story became a powerful reminder that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Though Samson had been blinded and imprisoned, he had still fulfilled his purpose, and his legacy was one of divine restoration. In the years that followed, Samson's name became synonymous with strength, sacrifice, and faith. He was remembered not just for his physical might, but for the lessons his life imparted to the nation. His story was passed down through generations, serving as a beacon of hope for the Israelites. His life, though full of struggle, was ultimately a life of divine purpose fulfilled. The restoration of Israel's power, symbolized by Samson's victory and death, was a direct result of his legacy. His actions were instrumental in breaking the hold the Philistines had over Israel, and the freedom Israel experienced in the years following his death was a testament to the enduring power of God's purpose. Samson's legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of the Israelites as a symbol of the possibility of redemption, even after great failure. The God who had chosen him, guided him, and ultimately used him for his divine plan remained faithful to Israel, even after Samson's death. His story would be remembered for generations to come, not just as the tale of a mighty man, but as the story of a man who, through his flaws and his failures, fulfilled God's will for the deliverance of his people. The story of Samson is one marked by great strength, but also profound weakness. His life was a testament to the fact that even the most gifted among us are still deeply human, vulnerable to failure and temptation. Yet in the end, Samson's story is also one of redemption, a powerful reminder of the faithfulness of God even when his chosen ones falter.
One of the most significant lessons that Samson leaves for the Israelites, and for us today, is the importance of placing full trust in God, even when we feel that our own strength is enough. Throughout his life, Samson relied on his physical power, believing that his strength was the source of his identity and purpose. But it wasn't until he was broken, blind and captive that he began to understand that his strength had never been his own. It was a gift from God. The hair that he had once taken for granted was not just a physical trait. It was the symbol of his covenant with God, a reminder that he was chosen to deliver Israel. When he cut his hair, it was not just a physical loss, but a symbol of his departure from the path God had set for him. However, even in the darkest moments of his life, Samson did not give up. It was in his final act, the destruction of the temple of Dagon and the death of thousands of Philistines, that Samson truly demonstrated the nature of redemption. Despite his flaws, God used Samson's sacrifice to fulfill the divine purpose for which he had been born. Samson's prayer in his final moments was a cry for strength, not for personal glory, but for the fulfillment of God's will. "Lord God, remember me," he prayed. "Strengthen me just this once, O God." This prayer was not a demand for vengeance, but an acknowledgement of Samson's dependence on God's grace. It was an act of faith, an understanding that despite his past, God could still use him for the redemption of Israel. His death was not in vain. It was a final act of service, offering his life as the ultimate sacrifice for his people. Samson's redemption came not in his victories, but in his willingness to surrender his will to God, even when everything seemed lost. In the broader narrative of Israel, Samson's story is a reminder of how God's purpose can be carried out through the most unlikely of individuals. Samson was not perfect. He was impulsive, proud, and at times disobedient. Yet God used him in a mighty way, showing that even those who fall short of divine expectations can still play a part in God's larger plan. Samson's life was a journey of growth, failure, and ultimately redemption. For the people of Israel, Samson's death was a pivotal moment in their history. It marked the beginning of their liberation from the Philistines. But more than that, it was a reminder that no matter how far Israel strayed, God would always provide a way to redeem them. His story gave hope to a nation suffering under the yoke of oppression, showing them that God's grace is always available, even after the greatest of failures.
Samson's legacy is not defined by his physical strength, but by his ultimate willingness to turn to God in his final moments. His story shows that redemption is always possible, no matter how far we fall. It is a lesson that echoes throughout Scripture. God does not give up on us, even when we fail. Samson's life and death exemplify the power of faith, forgiveness, and the willingness to be used by God, no matter our flaws or mistakes. The story of Samson is one that echoes with both triumph and tragedy, a tale of strength, weakness, and ultimately redemption. As we reflect on his life, we are faced with the stark contrast between his incredible physical prowess and his moral and spiritual struggles. Samson was born to be a hero, chosen by God to lead Israel out of oppression. Yet his journey was one fraught with personal conflict, mistakes, and at times a complete disregard for the divine purpose that had been entrusted to him. Samson's life serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers of pride, self-reliance, and the pursuit of personal desires over divine calling. His greatest strength, his extraordinary physical abilities, was both his gift and his curse. He relied on his strength to overcome challenges, often overlooking the spiritual dimension of his mission. It wasn't until his strength left him that Samson began to realize that true power doesn't come from oneself, but from a deep, trusting relationship with God. His relationship with Delilah, marked by both love and betrayal, highlights another crucial lesson. Samson's love for her, which led to his tragic downfall, exemplifies how emotional and personal attachments can cloud one's judgment and divert them from their higher calling. The moment he revealed the secret of his strength was the moment he fully relinquished his connection with the divine power that had been entrusted to him. Samson's fall wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It was a moment of weakness that led to his capture, blindness, and captivity. However, it was also in this state of utter humiliation that Samson rediscovered the true source of his strength: God. Samson's final act, the collapse of the temple of Dagon, was his redemption. In his last moments, Samson's plea to God for strength was not one of vengeance, but of surrender. It was a cry for God to use him once more to fulfill his purpose. His sacrifice was not just physical, it was spiritual, as he redeemed himself and delivered Israel from the Philistines at the cost of his own life. This act, though tragic, was his greatest triumph, as it demonstrated that even after failure, there was still room for redemption through faith and trust in God. The people of Israel, who had witnessed Samson's rise and fall, would remember him not just as the man who tore apart lions or killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, but as a man who, despite his flaws and failures, was used by God for a greater purpose. Samson's life was a testament to God's grace, showing that even the most broken vessels can be redeemed and used for His glory. In the end, Samson's legacy is one of faith, perseverance, and ultimate redemption. His story is a reminder that no matter how far one falls, God's grace is always available, and His purposes will be fulfilled. Samson's life teaches us that while we may fail and fall short, God can still use us to accomplish His will if we turn to Him in faith. His story serves as a powerful reminder that redemption is possible, even for the most unlikely of heroes. As we look back on Samson's journey, we are left with a story of human frailty and divine triumph. His journey of strength, failure, and ultimate redemption reflects the struggles we all face in life, the battle between our desires and our calling, between our weaknesses and the strength that God provides. Samson's story is a testament to the power of God's grace, a grace that can redeem and restore even the most broken of lives. Did you like the video? Don't forget to leave your like and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories, and activate the bell to receive notifications firsthand. And we want to know your opinion. Comment below what you thought of this video and share your thoughts with us. Let's be part of this journey of faith and learning together.